The question of whether Christians should support Israel has become increasingly prominent in recent discourse. But before engaging with the complexity of geopolitics and the modern state of Israel, we need to ask a more fundamental question. What is Israel according to the Bible? A growing number of voices, especially in response to the heated Ted Cruz-Tucker Carlson exchange, are claiming that the New Testament redefines the term Israel, applying it exclusively to the church. Many even go as far as to say that Jews are no longer God's chosen people, even that Christians are actually the real true Jews. Now, these claims are certainly not new. They're gaining traction online, but are they supported by Scripture? Let's take a closer look. One of the reasons so many people get the subject of Israel wrong is because they start with a flawed understanding of the word church. Most people picture the church as something brand new, birthed in Acts 2 at Pentecost, composed of both Jews and Gentiles. In this view, Jews leave their Jewish way of life and Gentiles leave theirs, and they merge into one homogeneous body with a single faith and practice. In the Old Testament, the people of God were, of course, Israel, but now, because Jesus has come, everything has now shifted to the church, which is often viewed as the new spiritual Israel. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have dispensational thinkers who say that Israel and the church are totally separate, running on parallel but disconnected tracks. Let's rewind and actually take a closer look at the word church. The Greek word is ekklesia, and there's a lot of confusion around its meaning. People often claim it means the called out ones, or they associate it with the public square. But in the New Testament, ekklesia simply means assembly or congregation. Before the New Testament was even written, ekklesia was already being used in the Greek Septuagint, the translation of the Hebrew Bible, as the equivalent of the Hebrew word kahal, meaning assembly. As in the Septuagint, the same word is used in the New Testament in reference to the congregation of Israel. So really, the ekklesia doesn't begin in Acts chapter 2. The assembly of God, his gathered people, has existed from the beginning. What changed is that now the Messiah has come, and therefore the Gentiles have been brought into that historic assembly alongside Jewish believers. The problem with our English word church is that it's typically understood as a uniquely Christian assembly, often contrasted with a synagogue, where, of course, the Jewish people are. Strictly speaking, church is not the best translation of ekklesia, although it has become standard through tradition and usage. This matters because when we read the New Testament carefully, we see that Jewish believers in Jesus remained practicing Jews. They didn't abandon their religion, their identity, or their customs. Just read the book of Acts, especially chapter 21. And Romans 4 verse 16 also confirms that the promise to Abraham is for both adherents of the law, that's Jews, and those who share the faith of Abraham, Gentiles. In the first century, the early ecclesia was predominantly Jewish. Gentile believers were welcomed in once they reached a decision that they were not required to become Jews. That's why Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek." But like the distinction between male and female, this doesn't erase present differences in role, identity, or practice. So they shared the same faith, but lived it out differently. Now let's talk about Israel. In the New Testament, the word Israel retains its Old Testament meaning. At times it refers to the land, for example, Matthew 2:21. Notably, the Greco-Roman term Palestine never appears in the New Testament. Occasionally, it refers to the man Israel, although the name Jacob is more commonly used. But in the vast majority of cases, Israel refers to the nation, the people descended from Jacob. Now, if you know your history, Jacob was given the name Israel, and it came to refer to his descendants, the 12 tribes. After the kingdom split, Israel referred to the northern kingdom, while the southern kingdom was called Judah. When the northern kingdom was exiled and disappeared, Judah remained. Over time, Israel became associated with Judah, the surviving remnant. After Judah's exile, many returned to the land, and Ezra and Nehemiah refer to them as Israel, though they were mostly from Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. And that's how Judah, and eventually Jew, became identified with the name Israel. Out of the 68 times Israel appears in the New Testament, and the 9 times Israelite appears, it almost always refers to ethnic Jews. Here are a few examples. Luke 2:32. Simeon calls Jesus a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. He speaks of 2 distinct groups here. Gentiles are the non-Jews, and God's people, Israel, refers to Jews. Acts 13:16, Paul addresses a Galatian synagogue. He refers to Jews, even outside the land here, as Israelites, and God-fearers are Gentiles. Romans 9:4-5, Paul says, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the covenants, the giving of the law, and more. He speaks in the present tense, referring to his fellow kinsmen. This pattern holds consistently throughout the New Testament. Israel refers to the Jewish people. So if we return to our diagram, Israel or Israelites rightly belongs within the circle marked Jews, as this is normative and synonymous language used in the text. So here's the big question. Does Israel ever refer to the church? Actually, let's refine that further. Since the ecclesia is composed of both Jews and Gentiles, and we know that Jews are a part of Israel, are there any verses that explicitly call non-Jews Israel or Israelites? The answer is no. The strongest case typically offered comes from one of the closing verses in the book of Galatians. In the NIV, it reads, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What counts is the new creation. Peace and mercy to all who follow this rule, to the Israel of God. Now, if we look under the hood, this translation takes the Greek ke in ke epiton Israel tou theou exegetically, like saying, that is the Israel of God. They signaled this with an em dash instead of translating the word directly, which is certainly possible. So at first glance, this seems to suggest that Paul is calling the church the Israel of God. But let's take a closer look. Yes, Paul is saying circumcision means nothing. That might sound like a rejection of Jewish customs, but we have to remember that Galatians is written to Gentiles who are being pressured into full Jewish conversion. So in that context, Paul's point is that what ultimately matters is not ethnic status or circumcision, but being part of the new creation, that is, sharing in the resurrection life of the age to come. Then he offers a blessing on those who follow this principle. Now, if Paul is referring to his audience as the Israel of God, it would be the only time the term Israel is redefined, or rather expanded to include non-Jews. And that hinges on one verse out of 68 verses in the New Testament and over 2,500 in the Old. The interpretation depends heavily on how you translate it. Compare how Galatians 6:16 reads in the ESV and most translations that follow the Greek closely. It says, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. The Greek kai, or ke, commonly translated as and, clearly links 2 groups: Gentile believers who obey Paul's instruction and the Israel of God, Jewish believers. This echoes chapter 2, verse 7, where both groups are represented in the same order. So in light of both the grammar and the consistent usage of Israel throughout Scripture, it's far more plausible that Paul is actually using the term here in continuity with its established meaning. Now let's look at a second claim, one I've heard from several influencers and even respected theologians, that all Christians, both Jew and Gentile, are the true Jews. The implication is that ethnic Jews are no longer truly Jewish in God's eyes. That may sound surprising, but consider this quote from well-known teacher John Piper. "I don't get up in the morning wishing I were a Jew. To say that you are not interested in being a Jew is like saying you are not interested in knowing your true identity. I would say you ought to want to be a true Jew because, quote, salvation belongs to the Jews. What a great thing it is to be able to go to the whole Bible, Old and New Testament, and know that this is my book. I am a Jew. As a non-Jew, should I claim the Hebrew Bible is mine because I'm now spiritually Jewish? That idea runs counter to what Paul says in Romans 9, 4 through 5. Speaking of his fellow Israelites, he writes, "To them belong," listing many things, including the giving of the law. He doesn't say "to you belong," because, as he says in Romans 3:2, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. So how does Piper and many others arrive at this idea? It's based on logic, not exegesis. Since Paul calls someone a Jew inwardly, that must mean Gentile Christians are now Jews. And once that interpretive move is made, every passage about Jews can now be claimed by Christians as referring to themselves. But where does Paul ever say that Gentile Christians are Jews? People often quote Romans 2:28 through 29 in support of this idea. It's a debated passage, and scholars are divided on how best to translate and interpret it. But to keep things simple, let's just look at the ESV. "No one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God." Some take this to mean that anyone, Jew or Gentile, can be a true Jew as long as they have inward faith. But is that what Paul is really saying? Let me summarize. In verses 17 through 29, Paul engages in a sharp rhetorical exchange with an imagined Jew, someone proud of having the law, boasting in their covenant status, and confident in their role as a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, referring to non-Jews. But Paul flips the script. He asks, "You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law?" He exposes the hypocrisy of preaching one thing while doing another, and argues that outward signs like circumcision mean nothing without obedience. Ultimately, the Jew who lives contrary to the law will be regarded as uncircumcised. And in a surprising reversal, Paul says that a Gentile who keeps the righteous requirements of the law, even without being circumcised, will be counted as if they were. What does he mean? He's saying on the day of judgment, what matters isn't ancestry or external branding, but your response to God. True Jewish identity, Paul says, is inward, a circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, or possibly in spirit with a lowercase s, not by the letter of the law. Only this kind of Jew receives praise from God, which is a fitting wordplay since Judah, or Jew, means praise in Hebrew. So clearly Paul is contrasting two types of Jews. One who is a Jew in name only, outwardly, skin deep, boasting in their identity while disobeying the Torah, and another whose Jewish identity is rooted in the heart, shaped by obedience and sincerity. Paul isn't saying that Christians, whether Jew or Gentile, are the real Jews. He's distinguishing between authentic and inauthentic Jewish identity. And he's not making up a new standard either. What he's saying isn't a radical break from the Hebrew Bible. It's a return to its deeper vision. A lot of people are not aware that the call for circumcised hearts, inner obedience, and spiritual transformation has always been there, from the Torah to the prophets. For example, Deuteronomy 10:16 calls Israel to circumcise your hearts. Compare Jeremiah 4:4. While Deuteronomy 30 verse 6 promises that God himself will circumcise their hearts, undoubtedly by the Spirit. See Ezekiel 36. So, what about Paul's radical claim that a disobedient Jew will be regarded as uncircumcised on the day of judgment, and that such a person will actually be condemned by a righteous Gentile who lacks both the law and circumcision? As shocking as it sounds, Paul isn't inventing this idea either. In Leviticus 26, God speaks of rejected or exiled Israelites as uncircumcised in heart, using covenant-breaking language to describe their spiritual condition. And take a look at Jeremiah 9:25 through 26. Judah is explicitly grouped with the nations as uncircumcised despite their physical circumcision. These passages show that disobedience nullifies the outward sign, that covenant status without covenant faithfulness is meaningless. Moreover, Isaiah 56, 3 through 7 says that foreigners who join themselves to the Lord will be gathered with the righteous, despite their status as non-Israelites. In light of these passages, it's actually not radical for Paul to assert that not all who are from Israel are, in fact, Israel. And if you read Romans carefully, you'll notice that Paul doesn't use modern phrases like spiritual Israel or true Israel, although the idea is similar. Instead, he uses a deeply biblical term, remnant. That's the language of the prophets, like Isaiah 10:22, which he quotes in the book of Romans. What is new in Paul's teaching is this: Jesus is the Messiah. And now that the Messiah has come, it's time for the nations, the Gentiles, to be gathered to him. This remnant, then, are those from ethnic Israel who respond in faith and loyalty to Jesus as Messiah. And I would also add, they can't be a faithful remnant if they've abandoned Torah observance. So what about greater Israel? Does Paul still call them Israel? Well, yes, he does. Does God still have a plan for them? Yes. Paul says in Romans 11, verses 12 and 15, that while Israel's rejection has led to Gentile inclusion, that's a positive thing, obviously, their future return will usher in an even more glorious outcome. Paul makes it clear again, a few verses later, that there will be a future national turning back to God. Look at verse 25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Paul tells his readers not to be uninformed about all this. God will ultimately bring about the salvation of all Israel, a future event that stands in contrast to the present remnant. Israel here clearly does not refer to the church, as some argue. That interpretation requires some serious theological gymnastics. Paul is using the term the same way he does throughout the entire chapter, to refer to ethnic Israel. Okay, final question. Should we still regard ethnic Jews as God's chosen people? Let's continue in verse 28. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of the forefathers, the patriarchs. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Notice that Paul is specifically referring to unbelieving Jews who oppose the message of Jesus. He says that even though they are enemies of the gospel right now, it's ultimately for the benefit of the world. He's repeating what he's already said back in verses 12 and 15. And listen carefully. Concerning their election, or their chosenness, Paul says that they remain beloved. They are still God's chosen people, not because of their righteousness and not because God plays favorites, but because God is faithful to the promises that he made to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I bring this up because I've seen a lot of people online speak with a kind of smug condescension towards anyone who still believes the Jews are God's chosen people. They assume that such belief either stems from biblical ignorance or from commitment to a modern Left Behind series type dispensationalism. And this is a false dichotomy. It's not about which theological camp you belong to. It's about reading what the text actually says. And here, Paul says it plainly. As for their chosenness, the Jewish people remain beloved for the sake of the patriarchs, because God's calling and promises do not fail. The New Testament doesn't teach that Gentiles replace Israel, nor that they remain separate from her. The picture is far richer than that. As Paul says, quoting Deuteronomy, "Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people." Gentiles are grafted into a Jewish faith and a Jewish Messiah. Through Jesus, they're no longer strangers or foreigners to the covenants of promise. They're welcomed fully into God's household, not as second-class citizens, but as beloved members of the family. But interestingly enough, Paul stops short of calling them Israel. Why? Because honoring the unity of God's people doesn't require erasing their distinct roles, whether male or female, Jew or Greek. God's ultimate purpose is this: for the nations to worship with Israel, not alone and not instead of her. That's the end game. Jews remain Jews, Gentiles remain Gentiles, but they become one in faith, united in worship under one God. As the prophets foretold, the Lord will be one and his name one.